But we've had this dream since my days at Marketo and beyond of the proverbial right action over the right channel at the right time for each person. We talked about that at Marketo really like 18 years ago, whether it was Eloqua or Marketo or you name it, looks like some kind of Visio diagram or set of rules. If this happens and they're in this industry and they are this persona and this is true and this is true, then you should take this action. And the more ands you want to do there to take into account more nuances of situation, the more your process flow ends up looking like spaghetti. And so because of literally the limitations of the technologies, we haven't, I think, ever actually delivered on the promise of true one-to-one personalization. The single biggest challenge of B2B marketing today is the mismatch between the expectations for how people want to measure marketing and the reality of how marketing actually operates. They want MQLs. They want to say, show me the impact you're having on this quarter. But buying is not a simple linear machine. It's not a gumball machine. It's not campaign in, opportunities out. It's this complex, non-linear process where oftentimes the reason why somebody bought today is a touch that happened 3 years ago, 5 years ago, maybe last week. You don't know. I've gone and given speeches at conferences, and talk about all these cool things that you should be doing with AI. People come up with me afterwards and like, my company doesn't even let me have access to ChatGPT. I'm like, maybe you need to work somewhere else. But because that company is going to fall behind. So it starts from leadership, allowing it and basically really saying like, this is what the job is. And then training and skill development, whether you're writing content or writing code, it takes time to learn how do you use these things. They talk about this thing called the Jagged Frontier in AI. The Jagged Frontier is that AI is really, really good at helping humans with some things, and it's really bad at other things. It can write a perfect sonnet in iambic pentameter, and yet it can't even properly count the number of words in a paragraph. I think one of the most important lessons is you just have to use this stuff every single day and try it and start to build that intuition around where the Jagged Frontier is. How do you get the best out of this? It's just like how people figured out email, right? In the early days, right? The people who did lots of experimentation with email were the ones who got ultimately good success out of email. I think we need to do the same thing with AI.
Jon and I worked together at Demandbase for a bit. We've been in the same circles for a very long time, but he was one of the people to convince me to come over to Demandbase when I started. And this episode is going to be a really good one for you if you care about AI at all, which, spoiler, you should. Jon talks about some of the history that he's seen as he's built organizations like Marketo and Engagio, both very successful paths of their own. And he's building a new stealth company now, which if you listen to the podcast, you can probably figure out a lot of what he's doing there. But we talk a bit about the cultural and organizational shifts we need to make, how this technology is changing our roles as humans, and what we need to be doing to be successful in all of our businesses. It's a great one. Jon's a wealth of knowledge, has some awesome recommendations for good reads and good people at the end too. So definitely check this one out. Hey everyone, welcome back to the OnBase podcast. I'm your host, Chris Moody. Today, I'm very excited to be reunited with Jon Miller. We've been at hundreds of events together, probably, Jon. We competed for a little bit based in some of the content marketing automation space, but really excited to have you here to talk about rethinking growth with AI. Thank you for joining us today and welcome to the show.
Thank you. I mean, it's just obviously a fan of you, fan of Demandbase, fan of the podcast, and excited to actually be a guest on this. So thanks for having me.
It's weird. I mean, you were one of the main powers behind all the content. Now we have you here. It's the full circle journey. And that's the first question we ask is really about your journey. And you can hit any of the high points or low points that you like, personal or professional, but tell everyone a little bit about what led you to what you're doing today.
Well, I always like to start with the fact that I studied physics in college and actually thought I was going to go become an academic, a full-time physics professor and researcher. But I took a detour into management consulting just to try it out and realized I liked it and have, but used physics, the quantitative background kind of throughout my career. I sort of fell into marketing technology by happen chance. The consulting firm I worked with ended up buying this old mainframe campaign management tool, which they redid as a client server system and spun it out. That company ended up being successful. It's called Exchange, and it actually went public in the late 90s. So when I was graduating from business school in the middle of the dot-com bubble, everybody's going to tech. I had never thought about working in tech myself, but that's what everybody was doing. And there was this company called Epiphany that was a pretty hot startup that was trying to build a campaign management software tool. And literally the fact that I just even had the loosest connection to this other company that they were a competitor to was enough to convince them to give me a job as one of their first product managers. So I started at Epiphany, and I mean, that was like, I think the hottest IPO of 1999. Went on to become one of, an early winner in the marketing technology space. But then the internet bubble crashed, and Epiphany, along with kind of everybody else, crashed along with it. And in 2005, we ended up selling Epiphany for, honestly, cents on the dollar compared to where it had been. I didn't want to take a job at the acquiring company. And so I remember calling my wife one day and saying, like, hey, I'm going to take the severance package instead of joining this firm. And she freaked out because she was pregnant with our first child. Not that long ago, we bought our first house, so we had a mortgage to pay. And I was like, no, it'll be fine. We'll work it out. And I spent a couple months interviewing for some regular jobs, but I also had some conversations with Phil Fernandez, who was the president and chief operating officer of Epiphany. And he and I got talking that there ought to be a new kind of marketing technology company. And this new software as a service thing that was coming around in 2005, 2006 seems like it's a pretty good way to sell marketing technology. And so long story medium, we decided to get together and founded the company that it became Marketo. And the vision was to make powerful marketing software as easy to buy as Google AdWords, because we recognize that marketers have money to spend. It's OpEx and not CapEx. And software as a service would allow us to give software in a way that they could buy the way they buy trade shows or Google Dollars and things like that. So I think most people know the Marketo story. I built that. I was the first, CMO there. But obviously as a founder, you do all sorts of things in the early days. And I stuck with Marketo for almost 9 years. Through the IPO. But the thing about being a founder, I realized, is that if you're not the CEO, the bigger the company gets, the more narrow your role gets. It's by definition, you just keep taking hats off and giving them to other people. And after a while, Marketo started to feel less like my baby and more like the job I worked at. So I had that sort of itch to leave and start something new. So in 2015, I left to start Engagio, which was, along with Demandbase, an account-based marketing platform. Built Engagio up for about a little over 5 years. The funny thing, is even though Engagio and Demandbase were both ABM platforms, we rarely competed head-to-head in deals. And we actually had a lot of companies that were using both, because what we did was incredibly actually complementary, between the two. So late 2019, early 2020, Gabe became the new CEO of Demandbase, and he and I started talking a little bit. We both shared our roadmaps, and frankly, everything that Demandbase wanted to build for the next 3 years was the things that Engagio had. Everything Engagio wanted to build for the next 3 years was what Demandbase had. And we were compelled that the vision of the combined solution would make the best platform out there. So in mid-2020, during COVID, we somehow managed to get a deal done and brought Engagio to Demandbase. I initially joined as the chief product officer, led the integration, and then in 2021 became the CMO. So that was when we brought you on board, and obviously we helped to evangelize account-based go-to-market, at the time. But even after a few years of doing that at Demandbase, that itch came back. I was like, oh, this is a good job, but it's still a job, and I want to start something else new. So I transitioned out of Demandbase in late 2023, spent some time figuring out what I'm going to do. And in 2024, I started a new company. So we're still in stealth, so I can't tell you all the details of what we're doing. But needless to say, I think that the legacy marketing technology platforms, including Marketo, are not innovating very fast. And I think they're certainly not keeping up with the age of AI. And that creates opportunities for some new solutions. And that's the story. From physics to Epiphany and Marketo and Engagio and Demandbase, and now the new thing.
I love it. And I think you've been branded as a lot of complementary things in the past, but one is futurist. I hear that a lot. You've always had a great ear to the ground of understanding what's next. You've made smart moves based on that. What stands out to you about this moment in AI and go-to-market strategy that makes it unlike previous shifts in marketing technology?
Well, it's not just shifts in marketing technology. I think most people would say what's happening in AI is probably the largest shift in technology that we've seen, if not the largest ever, at least on par with, the rise of the internet. It's interesting for, I think, two different dimensions. The first one is the new capabilities that AI creates. We can make software with AI now that we could not have imagined making before. I like to somehow look back in history to the rise of the internet as an example, right? Internet 1.0 companies took pre-internet business models and moved them online, right? So you could publish content in a newspaper and now you could publish it online, right? You could sell stuff in a store and now you can buy it at Amazon, That's kind of where I think we've been with AI as a product capability the last few years, right? You could write an email in the old days, and now you can have AI write the email for you, right? The way we're marketing is not fundamentally changed, right? But we're using AI to support it. Back to the internet though, what happened over time is new businesses that could not have existed without the internet started to emerge. Whether that is social networking or even things like Uber and Airbnb and whatnot, like fundamentally internet native businesses that required this new technology to exist. I don't think we've seen the emergence yet of the AI version of those companies, right? What is a business that required these new things as opposed to just doing things that we did before, faster, better, or cheaper? So that's the first kind of, I think, big change, right? Is the new capabilities that will come to bear in technology, to allow new kinds of companies, new kinds of capabilities. But the second thing I alluded to is AI is also profoundly changing how people buy. We're already seeing this with zero-click search, right? They're getting their results right on the search engine or in their LLM chatbot of choice, as opposed to going through to the web pages. We've already had some example of this in our email inboxes. If you have Google Gmail, the priority inbox basically says, hey, this email is more important than that email. That's going to happen even more. We're going to have AI agents in our inbox, reading the emails for us, processing them, drafting replies, and basically telling, okay, of all the emails, here's the 7 that I really need you to look at. So when that starts happening in our inboxes, what does that mean for traditional email marketing metrics, open rates, click rates? They're going to go the same way that search traffic is going because of zero-click search. So you got these two forces going on at the same time, right? Like fundamentally new things that are possible coinciding with fundamental changes in how go-to-market needs to work. You called me a futurist, thank you. I don't know, but I'll say, I don't have all the answers yet. I don't really think anybody does. I think we're in that phase where we're kind of all figuring this out together.
Yeah, I feel that too, John. This is the second podcast today, and I shared this on the first one before we hit record. That figuring it out point is so important. The questions we have to ask ourselves and how we need to think about planning and what we ask for with budget, what our big bets are, because it's a totally different construct with what we can do with AI and where we need to focus people to try to hit our numbers, to try to be more creative, to try to figure all those things out. As we think about that figuring it out phase, what are some of the lessons that you think our leaders, all of us, need to carry forward thinking about AI that you've learned from the waves you've been through? And I do think the .com is the best example, because in 99, I moved to Raleigh shortly after 99, but I remember hearing stories of Red Hat's initial splash, and Ferrari and Lamborghini would park cars for sale outside of the office because it was such a gold rush. And I think we're feeling this energy and surge, and we don't really know exactly what to do with it. So I'd love to hear the lessons you're thinking of that we all need to make sure we're listening to.
I think one of the lessons is that, they talk about this thing called the Jagged Frontier in AI. The Jagged Frontier is that AI is really, really good at helping humans with some things, and it's really bad at other things. It can write a perfect sonnet in iambic pentameter, and yet it can't even properly count the number of words in a paragraph, or do basic math. And so I think one of the most important lessons is you just have to use this stuff every single day and try it and start to build that intuition around where the jagged frontier is. How do you get the best out of this? And it's just like how people figured out email, right? In the early days, right? The people who did lots of experimentation with email were the ones who got ultimately good success out of email. I think we need to do the same thing with AI. And I think this is true whether you're a marketer or, even like an engineer who's vibe coding, right? Like, of course, if you're vibe coding, you're going to see the same experience that a marketer sees when you're writing content, which is if all you ask for is like, write me a blog post, you get a pretty mediocre blog post, right? If all you ask for is, write me some code, you're going to get mediocre code. It takes time to really learn how to use these things properly and effectively to get great results, to apply your wisdom and your experience to get the kind of results other people couldn't get using this tool. We just have to do that. Just like people had to learn how to search properly back in the day.
Yeah, I think some of the parallels between us being on a podcast and what we have to think about as we listen and asking great questions. I find myself in AI. The better the question I ask, it will help me better solve what I was trying to solve. So instead of just the prompt, which that's where I started when I was first using AI, it was do this, make this. I will start with, I'm trying to do X. What are the things I should be thinking about to do a better job of getting what I want for X? And a personal example, I did that for my 14-year-old baseball highlights. He had 7 strikeouts last night. I have all these videos. I don't want to go through and clip everything together. So I was just, hey, how can you make a highlight reel that I can send to him so he doesn't have to do it himself?
Yeah, as I say, don't use AI like a faster typewriter. Use it as actually, a new form of intelligence that helps you think better.
Yeah.
Right? That's a very important distinction.
What do you see as the biggest opportunities using AI to have true impact and go-to-market execution? Because I think initial waves of AI usage, they were all efficiency-based. But if you think about hitting pipeline, hitting revenue, where's some of the opportunities you're using AI?
Well, I think let's start with the changing buying dynamic that I alluded to. Sending more emails will not be, even if they appear to be personalized, right, is not going to work and stand out when everybody can do that same tactic. And we also get really good at sort of saying this is clearly still just AI slip-flop. It's probably worse than not trying to personalize in the first place. So I think it really comes down to using AI to get a quality instead of better quantity. The way I sort of like to think about it, is we've always wanted, we've had this dream since my days at Marketo and beyond of, the proverbial right action over the right channel at the right time, for each person. We talked about that at Marketo, literally like 18 years ago. The problem is that the traditional approach for doing that, whether it was Eloqua or Marketo or you name it, looks like some kind of Visio diagram or set of rules. If this happens and they're in this industry and they are this persona and this is true and this is true, then you should take this action. And the more ands you want to do there to take into account more nuances of situation, the more your process flow ends up looking like spaghetti. To the point that it's literally an unmaintainable set of rules. And so because of literally the limitations of the technologies, we haven't, I think, ever actually delivered on the promise of true one-to-one personalization. Now, I think the real opportunity for AI and one-to-one personalization, as I just sort of alluded to, is not write me an email for Chris. Because again, maybe AI gets there eventually where it's good enough, but we're not, I don't think we're there today. But what I think AI can do is work through that super complex combinatorial math of, all the possible segments that somebody might have and all the different personas and all the different behaviors and all the different actions, and almost like mix up the right playlist of actions to take that's going to be relevant and engaging for that person. That sounded complicated. So let me use an analogy to explain it, right? When you go to your Instagram feed or your TikTok or whatever is your network of choice, you see a different feed of posts than I see, right? And that's because an AI is sort of determining what are we are going to engage with, and find relevant, right? The algorithm isn't creating new posts, right? AI isn't spontaneously generating, here's a reel I created just for Chris right now. It's looking at this library of all the possible reels it could show. And it's saying, this is the best one to show him right now. And then what's the best one after that? And the best one after that. The difference between Instagram and go to market is Instagram is just trying to keep you on the page longer, right? To show you more ads. They only care about engagement. In B2B, we care, what is the sequence of actions that's going to move this person closer to revenue? How do we get their, not just that person, but their buying group closer to revenue? And to the extent that AI can start to string together those playlists, to me, that is the promise of one-to-one personalization, right? It's not mail merge personalization, but it's actually truly relevance at scale.
Yeah, I love relevance at scale. That's a great phrase. Saying evolution in the context of humans is not where I'm trying to go with this, but I do think there's a huge change in the roles we need to play as AI takes on more of the heavy lifting. I'm curious how you think our roles should evolve based on everything that we're talking about. So the fact that we can use AI to understand things that before may have not shown up in any diagram, chart, data set that we had.
I like to sometimes talk about the nuance between what I call the artist and the tactician when it comes to kind of go to market. If we want to simplify it to personas that are maybe people listening, it's the demand gen field marketers and it's the marketing operations specialists, right? But we can generalize that to, outside of just go to market to kind of, other pieces, of AI, right? And other pieces in the enterprise. So the artist, their job is to create the most compelling offer, experience, content, you name it, that's going to really connect with and engage some segment of the ICP that, a company is going after. And I think in many ways, that is a uniquely human task of understanding the market, creating and developing relationships, of creativity and even craftsmanship. And then you might even have an audience in mind when you're doing this, right? You might say, maybe it's just a dinner. This dinner is for VPs and above, right, who live in Chicago. You could be more nuanced than that. That's the artist's job. But today with marketing, somebody then still also has to go and decide, well, who am I going to actually go into the database and mail this thing to, right? And I need a fight. I'll do a select of VPs in Chicago, but I can't mail these people because they got this other thing yesterday. And I got to exclude these people because this is going on. And I don't want to and you just end up with like this complexity of trying to figure out what to actually send people and when, and especially when there are multiple things you might want to do. I might want to invite them to the dinner. I might want to send them, a request to be a reference if they're a customer. Oh, and I might also want to let them know about my new product announcement. Demandbase does this, right? I remember, I don't know if you guys still do this, but we used to have a weekly meeting we called air traffic control, where it's literally like, sit down, like, well, what are all upcoming campaigns and how are we going to manage this complexity, and all that kind of stuff. That's, that there's a tactician whose job it is to figure all that stuff out. But that's a perfect use case for AI, right? As we just said, just like the Instagram algorithm, let the AI figure out, we're going to show this to Chris at this time, and we're going to show this to John at this time. So you end up with this partnership, right, between the human and the AI, where the humans are about understanding the market and being creative and creating experiences. And the AI is about handling the data and the tactical optimization and the journey orchestration. And just to wrap that up, I think it's a perfect example of just what we were alluding to earlier. Like, a human by themselves can do good work, and then AI by itself can do okay work. But usually, I think the best outcomes are when humans and AIs can actually collaborate using their own strengths to deliver something that's better than either can by themselves.
Absolutely. I love that. And it feeds nicely into what I want to talk about next. And I'll give you the topic so you can be thinking, but it's on the organizational or cultural changes to pull this off. And the thing that comes to mind for me, in a lot of SaaS organizations that skew tech heavy, there's always been the notion of shadow IT and folks who go out and buy things and don't tell everyone else. And we've got this cool tool, but 3 people use it. AI fills similar to me, because you may have an organization where 2 people are using it well, and then you can just go down the maturity of how they're
Yeah.
using AI, and it's not a cultural norm, there's not governance, there's not a conversation around, hey, what prompts are you using? What's working well for you? What are the use cases? So I'm curious, through all the changes you've seen, you've been at innovative startups, you've been acquired, you've seen all that multiple times. What are the changes that we need to make as organizations to make sure that we're adopting an AI first go to market model?
Yeah, I mean, the technology is in many ways the easy part, and the hard part is getting the humans to kind of work with the machines. As I alluded to earlier, I think we're all still figuring some of this stuff out. But I think one thing is like super clear is that it starts with leadership, setting the expectation that, your work involves and requires you to partner with AI kind of in everything that you're doing. And then I think and then leadership has to make sure then the tools are available. I've gone and given speeches at conferences, and talk about all these cool things that you should be doing with AI. People come up with me afterwards and like, my company doesn't even let me have access to ChatGPT. I'm like, maybe you need to work somewhere else. But because that company is going to fall behind. So it starts from leadership, allowing it, and basically really saying like, this is what the job is. And then I think training and skill development. It's exactly sort of as I alluded to earlier, right? Whether you're writing content or writing code, it takes time to learn how do you use these things to get superhuman level output out. Like AI won't do it by itself, and you won't do it by itself. So how, invest in the training to help people really learn and understand, all that kind of stuff. And that includes the sharing prompts and things like that you're talking about. Although as a sidebar, it's something I wanted to say earlier. There's this thing going around these days that it's even less about prompt engineering, and now it's context engineering, right? Because the new models are pretty darn good at figuring out what to do, like reasoning. So your prompt doesn't need to be quite as much. Do this, then do this. Quite chain of thought. You don't have to do that as much yourself in the prompt. But what you do need to do is give it all the context. And so training people on context engineering, I think, is actually really important.
Yeah, I love that. There's a video that my wife and I both watch separately in our feeds, which is always interesting when that happens with AI and the algorithms. But it was a teacher, and the prompt that she gave her class, which was an elementary school class, it was describe how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And she would reenact or visually show them what they described with peanut butter and jelly, and if they forgot a step, she's actually putting it on her arms or whatever. And it was such a simple visual that felt very similar to what we're talking about, because without the right context, missing a step, setting the stage, you could be solving something in a very different way than what you intend. And I do think there's a parallel that we can find there.
I think that's all accurate. It also, I think, just to me, just gets to the point of almost like, as I said earlier with technology, the easy stuff is to use AI to automate the stuff you're already doing. The harder stuff is reimagining what could I not do before that I can do. I think that the companies, not outside the tech vendors, but like just the users, the marketers who ask that question and really reimagine some things are the ones that are going to be the most effective, the most successful in the age of AI.
We'll have a few questions left before we jump into the high-paced lightning round. Insert pyrotechnics. I need that in my office, like shoot off some fireworks. But the first is on storytelling. You've built incredible brands. You've been on the forefront of trying to create new categories and explain how to take very complicated solutions and make it a little easier to execute and hit your result. And you're doing it now. You're building a stealth company, so you'll have the storytelling and the brand building that will happen as soon as you can talk about it. How do you approach storytelling for complex products?
I've always, since my Marketo days and Engagio and Demandbase, approached creating content that was really focused on what the audience wanted to hear or needed to hear more than what I wanted to say. I always say, it needs to either be educational and valuable or at a minimum entertaining to the target personas. We made some fun entertaining videos back in the day at Demandbase as a perfect example of it's okay just if it's entertaining. and fun. Way too many companies get so wrapped up in who they are and what they do, right? That they miss out on just, what's valuable or entertaining to my persona. When you embrace it that way, what's really interesting is it gives you the freedom to talk about way more stuff, right, than specifically narrowly focused on what you do. So that's one factor. I think another factor is I think way too many people ignore the emotion. Stories work inherently because there's emotion, there's tension, there's some drama that needs to be unresolved. And there's other emotions you can kind of play in there. But I think the best storytelling kind of taps into an emotion. So as just an interesting example for that, like, yes, I'm building this new company in stealth, right? Why am I doing that? A big part of the reason I'm doing this in stealth is not because, oh my gosh, I'm afraid people are going to copy my idea that's so amazing idea. Like, listen to this podcast, you can probably start to figure out what I'm doing, right? The reason I'm doing this in stealth is to create some drama, right? Like, there's a velvet rope up, behind kind of what I'm doing, and there's, I want to create some excitement. Like, what's going on in there, right? How do I get in, and that, so that way when I finally do kind of open up the velvet rope and unveil this thing, right, it hopefully is got all this potential energy that's built up. I can quickly turn that into kinetic energy and look how fast we're going. Hopefully that doesn't sound too self-serving, but I just think it's an example of a form of B2B storytelling that most people don't use, right? And it's all about tapping into that emotion.
Yeah, I think that was perfect. One more question, then we have some very fast ones. The challenge here is you can only say one thing. So it's a limiting factor here. What is the single biggest challenge in B2B marketing today?
That one's easy to answer. The single biggest challenge in B2B marketing today is the mismatch between the expectations for how people want to measure marketing and the reality of how marketing actually operates. They want MQLs. They want to say, show me the impact you're having on this quarter. But buying is not a simple linear machine. I like to say it's not a gumball machine. It's not campaign in, opportunities out. It's this complex, nonlinear process where oftentimes the reason why somebody bought today is a touch that happened 3 years ago, 5 years ago, maybe last week. You don't know. Was it something you did? Something that somebody else did? A conversation they had at an event? You don't know. So the reality is the drive for MQLs and the short-term pressure that the current measurement metrics put on marketers forces them to do the wrong thing that I think is actually harmful to the customer relationship in the long term. We need to think about new ways of how we're going to measure marketing that's better aligned to the way marketing actually works.
Yeah, very easy to do, right? No.
Easier said than done. Fair enough. Yeah.
No, I agree with you. All right, we have some quick hitters before we close out. And the most important question we will save for last. The first, though, what are your favorite tools or technology that you're using today? And you can say your stealth tool if you'd like to plug that without saying it.
Let me first off by just challenging the kind of the tool first mentality. I think that, as we sort of talked about, there's too many marketers looking for, if I just buy the next tool, then all of a sudden all my problems are going to go away. And instead, do you have the right fundamentals in place? Do you have the right product market fit? Do you have the right positioning? Do you have the right brand in place? Don't worry about what tool until you have that stuff kind of, figured out right. I'm going to give that said, people want to hear about tools. That's fine. Couple that I'm big fans of these days is, I think you use this yourself, Descript for video editing is one that just, has sometimes that feeling of okay, this is close to a magical experience for editing things like this. Something that's not in go-to-market per se, but I've really been a fan of recently is a company called Crosby.ai, which is an AI-enabled law firm. So when I have a customer contract I need reviewed, I send it to them over Slack. And within 3 or 4 hours, I get it back with red line markups under Fave Legal, ready to go back to the customer, including here's what I should say to the customer. But it's not just an AI doing it. It's more than just they ran it through ChatGPT. It's actually a law firm that has lawyers that are making sure that when I'm getting back, they're following their kind of fiduciary responsibilities. So big fan of a couple of those tools.
It's awesome. I love that. And definitely strategy first. I think we could have a whole separate podcast about how
Definitely
tool
worth
first leads to churn.
starting with that one.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. What about good reads? We're really generous with this. It could be book, blog, newsletter, podcast, any type of content. But what are some of your standouts that you find inspirational?
Yeah, as a CEO, I really focus a lot on how to build the right company culture and environment that I want. So for me, my Bible on building a healthy company is Patrick Lencioni's The Advantage, which rolls up his writings from sort of summarizes the ideas from all of his other parables that he's written. It's actually more impactful if you read the parables first. Things like 5 dysfunctions of a team and death by meeting and all that kind of stuff. But the advantage itself kind of brings everything together. Another one is Setting the Table by Danny Meyer, the founder of the Union Square Hospitality Group. He really talks about catchphrases, like just the things that you just say over and over and over again that help define a culture. And I think that's really, really powerful. And my last one is Turn the Ship Around, which is a book by a USS Navy submarine captain who metaphorically turned his ship around from a low performer to a high performer by basically empowering the sailors to stop asking for permission. He told them, instead of asking for permission to do something, just tell me what you intend to do. And that simple language change really unlocked a lot of empowerment for people. So those are some of the cultural business books that I go to and like to recommend.
Great examples. The organization I was at before Demandbase, my boss, The Advantage, was required reading. So we talked about that a lot. It's a great one. What about the people who inspire you? Who stands out in the B2B space that help you stay in a good mental state for what you need to try to go and do?
First, I'll give you Chris Penn, who is, I think, I learned more about AI from him than I think perhaps anybody else. So he's got a great newsletter, a great blog. He's got a course, a book you can buy. I highly recommend all of that. Kieran Flanagan also is doing some really good, he's got Medium newsletter and whatnot, with AI, where he just shares super detailed prompts that are, even if I don't use them directly, are kind of worth seeing how he thinks about prompting and all that kind of stuff. Outside of AI, you might have had her on the podcast. If not, you should. Kathleen Schwab is an ex-IDC analyst who recently published a book called Marketing in the Great Big Messy World. And she, more than anybody else, I think, just nails this task of explaining that marketing is not a simple linear machine. She says it's not a vending machine, but is complex and nonlinear in ways that are more like the stock market or the weather. And then once you embrace that that's how marketing actually works, she then has practical tips for what does that mean for how should you actually run the department. So big fan of her and what she's writing.
Great recommendations. We are right on time. Within the minute, we have one more question. Most important one. How can everyone get in touch with you after this podcast?
Best ways on LinkedIn. I post on LinkedIn multiple times a week. So follow me. Feel free to email me, comment on my stuff. That's the best way to reach me.
Well, Jon, it was great seeing you again. Thanks for hanging out.
Thanks. Look forward to seeing you in person in a couple of weeks. But yeah, it was awesome to have this opportunity.
All right. I appreciate it. Talk soon.